Hi, Kristen Atchison here, and we're going to be covering Chapter 1, Frameworks for Development, out of Harwood's textbook. So first of all, let's kind of cover how we kind of approach looking at child development. While we call it child development, we can't just look at the child by itself. We must also look at the context that that child is brought up in. So we've got to look at the family, we've got to look at the educational setting, peers as that child ages and grows, the community that child's being raised in, what's the culture of that community, what are the norms of that community, the cultural values and beliefs. So what does that culture value? What kind of behaviors does that culture value? What kinds of things are not allowed? All of those are important to kind of look at this context that the child is growing up in. A really great theory that looks at both the child and the context is Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. So you see kind of the image here on the right where we have the child in the center, and we have four different systems, levels of systems more, that affect the child's development. So the first of which is the micro system, and that's that peachy color in the middle, right next to the child, and that is the settings that have direct influence with the child. So the parents, the siblings, that's all in that home environment, in that home microsystem. Religious settings. Again, the adults and peers that they're engaging with in these religious settings. That's part of the microsystem. Again, we're having direct contact with the child themselves. The school or the educational environment, whether that's a school or whether that's a homeschool environment, and who else is involved in that, the kind of school that is, the peers that are there, the teachers that they're engaging with, those are all part of the microsystem. Again, we're talking about direct contact with the child at the microsystem level. The neighborhood, who does the child hang out with in the neighborhood? The adults, the peers, again, these sorts of things. So again, this can be, the neighborhood can include things like the playgrounds that are nearby, or the parks, where you're having this direct interaction with the child. And again, this is both consists of the physical characteristics and people. So, is there a lot of kind of green space in this neighborhood, or is it a very, very urban setting without a lot of green space? That's that physical characteristics of that environment. And these things change over time. They're not necessarily static. A child may be the oldest child, and so he starts out as it just being parent and child interaction, but as siblings may be added to the family, then that changes. Schools change over time. Maybe the school starts out kind of overcrowded, but then they get more teachers and more space, or a new elementary school opens up, and so kids are taken out of the first school and put into another one, so that we have a different kind of ratio between students and teachers, or the vice versa can happen. You can have a really good ratio, and all of a sudden there be growth in the environment, and that school population go up. So again, these change over time. And then you get exposure to different people. So my daughter's, kindergarten teacher is different than my daughter's first grade teacher. Her school environment is changing over time. Even some of her specialist teachers have changed just from one year to another, even though she's in the same school. We're in the same neighborhood. All of that's the same. That system, that environment is changing over time. And so again, we have to think about that as well. The Meso System is that kind of that light blue circle, and that is the interaction of those microsystems with each other. So how home and school interact. So how the parents interact with the school, how the family interacts with the school. Are the parents very involved at the school, or the parents not? Those are different kinds of things. Again, and this can be any of those microsystems. So that includes the religious settings and the neighborhoods, those kinds of things. Maybe the child is really engaged on the microsystem level in some sort of activity, baseball or gymnastics. That can be a microsystem for them, because that's that one-to-one interaction with them. So again, it really is, those microsystems are very specific to the child and the child's kind of interactions. And then those mesosystems are how those systems interact with each other. Okay, so again, how the home interacts with the neighborhood. Do you know your neighbors? Do the parents know their neighbors? Do the children know their neighbors? Or are they very, very isolated? And what we see is that the interconnection of systems, the better connected these systems are, the better connected school is with home, and the better connected home is with neighborhood, we tend to see better outcomes because we have these systems working together for the benefit of the child. And so you see, especially in school systems, why they really try and push for parental involvement. And that's because they know that when these microsystems are involved on the mesosystem level, and that we really see beneficial outcomes for the child. So again, this is how those microsystems interact with each other, is what mesosystem is. The next one we have is that kind of yellow peachy line, the exosystem. And these are the social settings that can affect the child, but that the child's not a direct participant in. Local government, the parent's workplace. If parent's workplace is not great for parents and parent is coming home stressed, that's going to affect the child. The child's not going to the workplace. The child's not involved there. But that work environment affects the parent, which remotely then affects the child. So again, they're not active participants in the exosystem, but their decisions that happen on that level affect them. School board. The school board makes a decision one way or another that either benefits the system or hurts the system, and that's going to tangentially affect the child. It's going to indirectly affect the child. So again, these exosystems are still things that are very, very relevant to their environment and very, very relevant to their the context that they're in, but they're not an active participant in that system. Local industry. So what kind of industries around? Is it a very industrial area? Is it not? Again, these are the kinds of things that can indirectly, the child's not an active participant in them. They're not working at the docks. But if they're in an environment where there is a lot of shipping and those sorts of things, that can affect their environment. So again, the exosystem are those social settings that can affect that child, but that they are not actively a participant in. It's important to remember that all of these microsystems, mesosystems, and exosystems all change over time. Okay, so again, we're going to have differences as time goes on in all of these. Some years, the school and the home may be really, they have a really great relationship and communicate really, really well. And some years they may not. So again, and even within a year, there can be ebbs and flows in that. So again, it's important to remember that these things aren't static. They are changing over the passage of time too. So if you kind of added a third dimension to this image and made it 3D and kind of made it more like a tube instead of just a cross section, you would kind of see more the change over time. And then finally, the macro system is those cultural influences that shape the values, beliefs, and traditions. These tend to be more stable. We don't see a lot of change necessarily within a year or two, but over time, there definitely are changes. And over the development of a child and over a childhood, even just birth to 18, we can see big changes. And we see there are changes happening kind of in our own cultural beliefs and traditions within these kind of 18 time frames. So marriage equality is one of those things. For those of you who are 18, 20, that clearly wasn't a thing when you were a kid. Marriage equality was not something that was readily available in the United States. Last summer, it became readily available in the United States. And so again, we see, and a lot of that came about because there was a change in the cultural beliefs about that there were more people saying, no, it is right for everyone to be able to marry. There's been a cultural change there. So again, these tend to be more stable, but they definitely can change as well. one really good thing that really comes out of this Bronfenbrenner ecological model is that individuals, so the child or you, because this doesn't necessarily stop when you hit 18, are both products and producers of their own environment. So the way to think about that is that the child can create their own environment, but that environment can cause change for the child as well. So kind of an example from my own life and with my child is my daughter's really into science. She really, really likes science. And I think it really is because she's both a product and a producer of her environment. So part of the reason she probably really likes science is because her mom really likes science. And her uncle and her dad and her grandparents all really like science. And so I grew up in this kind of science world. And so I'm raising my daughter in this kind of science world. But the kind of science that she really likes is different than the kind of science I really like. She really likes space. That is her thing. She's very excited about NASA. She's been to a lot of the different NASA sites. Her favorite shows are about space. She was an astronaut last year. That's not my area of science. So I kind of created this science-loving environment, and she is creating this space-loving environment. We're giving her access to all this space stuff because she's very, very interested in it. Whereas we created that science environment for her, she's deciding that it wants to be kind of space. So she's getting increased access to this information about space because that's what she's interested in. Whereas the kind of maybe the science is somewhat coming from the environment that we produced for her. So again, they're both products and producers, and these things go together. We're going to talk a lot about bidirectional interaction. And what that is that little arrow that you see in the Meso System, where it's an arrow that has 2 points, because it's going both directions. Home affects school, but school affects home. That's a bidirectional interaction. And we see that with the individual and their environment, that it's a bidirectional interaction. The individual affects their environment, and the environment affects the individual, and it keeps going back and forth. And we see this again and again throughout development. So this is really, if you don't take anything else home, make sure that this is your take-home message from Bronfenbrenner, is that we are, again, and this is not just in childhood, but overall, we are both products and producers of our own environment. It's also important to remember the effect of culture. So when we were talking about that exosystem, when we were talking about that macro system, it's important that cultural information is playing a role. That can be things that are on more of a microsystem, so the physical settings and the conditions of life, but larger things like childcare customs. Different cultures have different views on who's appropriate to take care of children and how that's handled. The roles of mothers and fathers, the roles of mothers and fathers working outside of the home. Those things are different in different cultures, and that creates different childhoods for different individual children. Child rearing beliefs and goals are different too. And so you see, and we can see these differences within generations. And part of that is because sometimes the culture changes too. But we see it especially between different cultures, that what one culture says is necessarily appropriate for child rearing, another culture may think is absolutely wrong. And so again, there are differences in this. There are different goals in this. Are you trying to raise your child to be very, very independent? Or are you trying to raise your child to be a team player within your culture and within your community? Those are very, very different goals. And so you do very, very different things culturally, not necessarily thinking about it. This isn't, oh, I'm going to raise my child to be in an individualistic society. It just kind of happens. So again, we see that this really creates different kinds of niches of childhood, where they can look very, very different depending on the cultural, the impacts, the physical settings, the child care, and what the culture believes is appropriate for child rearing. So kind of the big major question that you always hear about development. Is it nature or is it nurture? What does this mean? Nature refers to the biology or the heredity of something. So is this something, does my daughter like science because I like science? Is it something genetic? And do I like science because both my mom and my dad like science? Is it genetic? Again, that's a question. Whereas nurture is that context, the social influences, and those physical words around them, that environment. Is that why my daughter likes science? Because we created an environment where she likes science. Is that where I like science? Because there was an environment where science was readily available. Again, that's the question. Which one is it? Is it both? Does one play a bigger role than another? And that's a question we'll ask kind of again and again over the course of the class. But what we really know is that both are really, really important. It's not ever really all one or the other. Occasionally, but most things really have both in play, especially when we're talking about complex behaviors, complex kinds of phenomenon. Those are rarely one or the other. They really are kind of a mixture of both. And we'll see that different theories disagree to what extent nature plays a role or what extent nurture plays a role, what role genetics plays versus which role environment plays. We'll talk about some in chapter 3, even on the genetic level, that both biology and environment can be very important, even just as something as on the genetic code. And we're not even talking about behaviorally. We'll talk about that some in chapter 3. And that's what we're going to talk about. This gene and brain chemistry can be very responsive to these environmental influences. So this is not just behaviorally, this can be on the genetic level as well, that both nature and nurture are, again, bidirectionally interacting. So nature affects nurture and nurture affects nature, and it goes back and forth and ongoing, just like we talked about with that ecological theory. So within this nature and nurture question, there are also the questions of individual differences. So when we have stability of individual differences, where the difference between Joe and Susie is stable, that's a theory is going to favor heredity. So when we see a theory that says Joe is different than Sally because maybe Joe is male and Sally is female, those can be genetic differences, and so that theory is going to favor heredity. Where we see a theory that looks at the plasticity of individual differences, that we see changes over time. So plasticity, plastic's very bendable. So when we talk about plasticity, we're talking about the malleability, the bendability, the flexibility of individual differences. So when we see these differences in people and they change over time, that theory is going to favor the context and the experiences. That theory is going to favor nurture. Again, neither one of them is usually all or none. It usually is this interaction between the both. Within these different kinds of theories of developmental science and developmental psychology, we have continuous theories. Continuous theories would be like the tree on the left, the graph of the tree, that we have this process of gradual development, that it builds on existing skills and processes, and we have a really pretty smooth line for development. Skills are acquired and they're added one at a time through experience. And again, we get this kind of gradual development. We're discontinuous theories, which we also refer to as stage theories. And we'll talk about both kinds of theories in this class. Discontinuous theories, where we have kind of a new skill or new understanding emerges at a specific time. We'll have really stable periods, so those kind of flat lines, followed by abrupt changes. So when we see kind of the developmental progression of this ladybug here, we have really discrete stages. We have the egg, we have the larvae, we have the pupa, we have the fully grown adult. So we have all those different levels. And again, they're very discrete. You can draw a line between them. We have abrupt change, followed by, again, another period of stability. So again, and we'll see that both theories can happen and change can happen in both ways. So it's, again, for this foundations, this is just kind of giving us the background of how to kind of think about development as we go in and we talk about the different kinds of development and different areas of development. Another way we do this is with normative versus idiographic development. Normative is, what does the average child do? So when you hear about milestones for children, children talk at this age and they walk at this age, they're talking about normative development. They're talking about, we took everybody, what they did, we averaged it, and this is on average what people do. Whereas idiographic is, how does the individual child do? And both of those are really important too, okay? And even with the normative, how does the average child do? Even with those normative theories, there's a range around that of what is in that normative range. But it's important to look at that individual differences too, that idiographic, because there's a lot of information there too. So it's important to look at both of those. Just like we looked at both nature and nurture, it's important to look at both the normative and the idiographic. It's important to look at both the continuous and the discontinuous theories. Because if we just say, oh, this is the one, usually we're wrong. The current view of developmental psychology and developmental science is that it's not so black and white. We have both continuous and discontinuous change. Nature and nurture are interwoven. You can't take one and say, this is it. Again, it's not so black and white. Both normative and idiographic information provide really important information. And if you just look at averages, you miss the nuances of individuals. And if you just look at individuals, you miss the overall trends of normative. So again, both of these are really important for understanding development. We see that there are both cultural differences and similarities in development. There's a lot of things that really are universal. We'll see babbling in the native language happening at about the same time, really on that normative kind of way, that normative perspective. And we see physical changes associated with biology, that same kind of way, kind of a normative, an average time that this happens. But we also see a lot of cultural differences, and those cultural differences we get to look at really well with more idiographic theories. And again, that depends on the expectations of the culture, like we talked about with the niche. It depends on the goals of socialization. What are we trying to teach these children to do? What are we teaching these children are important? What are the goals of this socialization? And again, those are going to be different in different cultures. And that, again, doesn't mean that one culture is doing it right and one culture is doing it wrong. They have different goals, and so they have different ways of doing that. And that's important information to look at too. Another current view, and this is one of my favorite theories of development, is dynamic systems theory. And this was really first discussed in terms of development by Esther Thalen. And the idea is that it's perpetually ongoing process, and then it's not one line, it's more of a web or a network of development. And it involves the biological, the psychological, and the social factors. And when you have a change in one level, that will allow changes on the other level. So when you finally, as a baby, figure out how to take your spoon and bang it on your high chair, that physical change of that motor control that you can lift up your spoon and hit it really affords you a lot of opportunity to start learning about your environment. You learn about the sound that makes. You learn about how when you apply different pressure, that sound is different. And so it's allowing cognitive change based on this physical change. And so again, we have the changes in different levels allow changes on all the other levels. That is, again, this web of development. We also see in this web of development that different people can end up at the exact same place and have the exact same skills and very, very similar outcomes, and have come at it from very, very different routes. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio. If you do this, this will happen. You can have an outcome that has many different ways of getting to that outcome with this dynamic systems theory. Because again, it's more this web of development. It's the understanding that all these different levels of development interact with each other. That physical is not by itself, that cognitive is not by itself, that social emotional is not by itself. There was a really great article that I read in graduate school, and the title was just perfect. It was called The Humpty Dumpty Problem, that we as developmental psychologists have spent so much time taking each of these processes apart to figure out how it works, but how do we put it all back together? How do we put all these little pieces of cognition back together? How do we put all these little pieces of socialization and social development back together? And then how do we put that back together so we get the whole child and we can look at the whole child together? Because social development affects cognitive development, and cognitive development affects social development. Again, we have this web of development where these things are working together to reach these outcomes. So let's just finish up with some discussion of what development really is and that kind of theoretical approach that we're going to take to this class. So development is lifelong, okay? It really is a conception to death kind of a thing. When I teach lifespan development, that's what we cover. We cover conception to death because it is really lifelong, and no single period is supreme. We don't say, okay, well, you know, prenatal is it. Everything is prenatal, or everything is infancy, or everything is early childhood. No, all of them are important. All of them provide different opportunities for different kinds of change and different kinds of growth. We really have broad domains of change in this lifelong development. The ones that we were talking about in dynamic systems. Physical, cognitive, social, and emotional, these broad domains. And again, change in one of those can cause changes in the other. Development is also multidimensional and multidirectional. So when we talked about that web of development, that was a multidimensional kind of thing. It involved biology, psychology, and social forces all affecting the outcome of that child, the outcome of that adult, the outcome of that organism. But it's important to remember that that development is also multidirectional. We have periods of growth and decline. We'll have what's called U-shaped development, where a child or an adult can't do something, they all of a sudden can do it, and then they can't do it again. We'll have, or the reverse, where they can do it, they can't do it, and then they can do it. We'll have N-shaped development, where again, we have that change back and forth between being able to do something and not being able to do something. This period of growth and this period of decline. And we'll see these across various domains of development. We see it in physical development. So if you hold a very, very young baby on a table so that their feet are kind of touching the surface or the tops of their feet, they'll perform a stepping pattern before long before that they can walk. And at some point, that reflex goes away. And then it comes back in terms of walking. So that would be an example of U-shaped development. They can do steps. They can't do steps when that reflex goes away, and then they can do steps again when they learn to walk. So again, every period have growth and decline. We'll see this later on in language development. We'll see it in terms of of verbs. So usually children first learn the irregular verbs correctly. So blow versus blew. First, they learn it correctly. So I blew a bubble because they hear their parents saying that. But when they learn that rule of, when you did something in the past tense, you add ed, they'll start incorrectly applying that rule. I blowed a bubble, when that's not the correct way to do that. And eventually they'll go back and they'll learn that that's an irregular, and they'll start using it correctly again. So again, we have this growth and decline, and we have these multi-directional changes in each domain. So again, with that physical development, we saw that step, that U shape. With the language development, we saw those same growth and decline periods in terms of applying those irregular verbs. Development is also highly plastic. So remember I talked about plastic as being highly able to change, highly malleable, again, very allowing a lot of change. So we have this high ability for change across development, and we see this across, again, all stages of development. There's plasticity that in all areas of development. However, there is more plasticity younger in development. So we do see a lot more plasticity in infancy than we do in early childhood. We see a lot more plasticity in early childhood than we see in adolescence. We see a lot more plasticity in adolescence than we do in adulthood. We see a lot more plasticity in early adulthood than we do in late adulthood. All of those periods have plasticity. It's just we have differing levels of plasticity across time. Development is also affected by these multiple interacting factors. Again, this comes back to that dynamic systems theory, that biology and society and culture and all of these things are interacting to affect change on the organism. So these multiple interacting factors, again, biological, historical, social, and cultural. Some of these can include age-graded influences. So the milestones, language acquisition, starting school, puberty, driver's licenses. These are things that within a culture have kind of a starting point. So starting kindergarten has, you're 5, almost 6 sometimes when you start kindergarten, you're 5 years old. So it's an age-graded influence. You get your driver's license at 16. You can get your permit at 15. Those are age-graded influences. Language acquisition, typically we see really a good language immersion around 2, sometimes before that, but we really are getting lots and lots of words in at around 2. Again, it can be affected by history, history-graded influences. We can have what's called cohorts, which is a group of people that have shared a particular event together during a particular time. So my grandmother grew up during the Great Depression. And so she had a very different kind of view on how you spend money and how you use resources and how you use food and how you use anything. Every single bag that bread came in got reused for something because she didn't waste anything, because she grew up in this time period where there wasn't a lot and you had to make the most of every single resource you had. So she was in a cohort that was very, very different than the cohort my mom grew up in, where there was a lot more affluence, there was a lot more of stuff. And I even grew up in a very different cohort than my mom. And so again, we have different views on sometimes our resources and what we're going to use and how we're going to use those resources because we had these different kinds of environments that we grew up in. This can be things like wars, epidemics. So the Great Depression was an example of that versus the prosperity that I grew up with in the 80s. Those are very different things than my grandmother's Great Depression versus the prosperity of the 80s. So we had different cohorts because of the different economic times that we grew up in. Technology can be one of those things too. The different technology cohorts my grandmother and I were in were very, very extreme. My grandmother was slightly scared of her remote control for her VCR. So, technology was not something that my grandmother did well. Whereas clearly technology was something where the internet was coming of age really when I was in high school and middle school. So again, I had a different cohort, and you all have a different cohort on technology than I do, because there was really never a time when you didn't have the internet wasn't a thing. So again, we'll see different influences of that because we're in different cohorts. It's also, we have the influence of non-normative influences, and these are these irregular events that happen to just one person by themselves or few people. They can be good or bad, but they can affect one's development. So meeting a spouse can be one, having an inspiring teacher, having cancer can be, or any illness can be a non-normative influence. So one of my best friends was diagnosed with cancer in college. And that really has shaped a lot of her outlook on things. It shaped her family structure. It shaped a lot of different things in her life because she had that non-normative influence. of getting cancer when she was in college. Whereas I didn't have that same situation. And we had a third member of our group, both my friend that had cancer and I both met our spouses in college, where the third member of our group is still unmarried. And so we have, again, different non-normative influences. It's not that one is right or wrong. And in terms of spouses, it's not that one is better or worse, but they have affected our development because we've had different situations. So that's going to wrap up our conversation about the foundations of development. Please make sure that you're doing your class attendance assignment and turning it in by the deadline. And I'll see you in class. Thanks.